I honestly do not know how to handle the events that have transpired over the past several months. I wake up in a cold sweat in the middle of the night and look out into the darkness of my room, afraid of something that isn't even there. I don't know if I even believe everything that's happened to me. There is only one thing that I am completely sure of, however. Real or not, I am scared. To understand the genesis of this story, we must go back to the beginning of the year when I was working as a pizza delivery driver for a local pizzeria near my residence. The pay was dismal, but it was merely a means to make some extra money before returning to college in the spring. Typically, our pizza shop closed at midnight, and deliveries ceased at 11:30 p.m. to allow the drivers to assist with closing. However, one fateful Saturday night, an order came in around 11:45 p.m. It was an order for 8 large pizzas, destined for a house located far away from the shop. My boss, motivated by his frugality, decided to accept the order despite its late hour and considerable distance. Much to my chagrin, I was the chosen driver for this ill-fated delivery. Entering the address into my phone, I realized it would be a nearly 30-minute drive, and considering the time it took to prepare the 8 large pizzas, I would likely reach the customer's house around 1 a.m. Annoyed by the late hour and extended drive, I consoled myself with the expectation of a generous tip for my trouble. Finally, after an agonizing wait, the pizzas were ready, and I loaded them into my car. I arrived at the given address around 1 a.m., precisely as I had predicted. The house, though impressive, stood isolated on a hill in the middle of nowhere. As I gazed upon it from my car, I noticed the front yard was in a state of disrepair. The grass, untouched for months, grew wildly, covering the entire yard, and an unusual sight in our snowless region. Strangely, despite the grandeur of the house, there were no cars in the driveway, and all the lights inside were extinguished. I couldn't fathom why a house so far removed from civilization had ordered 8 large pizzas. Skepticism gnawed at me, and I had a lingering sense of foreboding even before I got out of my car. As I walked towards the front door, I realized the grass around me was even higher than I had initially thought, a testament to prolonged neglect. It was as if the yard had been abandoned for ages. My unease grew when I saw a note taped to the door. It read, "Dear Pizza Boy, please come in. Do not ring the doorbell. Thank you." I had doubts since arriving at this enigmatic house, but now I was certain something was amiss. It felt like an elaborate trap, and the idea of being abducted sent shivers down my spine. Ignoring the note's instructions, I rang the doorbell. Minutes passed with no response. Hearing nothing, I stood alone on the porch, 8 pizzas in tow. I stood there a little while longer, not moving until I finally reached up for the handle to go inside. But then I remembered something. A couple of weeks earlier, a young boy named Billy Holmes had been abducted in broad daylight, not 3 miles from this very house. Despite our peaceful neighborhood, such an event had rattled our community, making me cautious. I withdrew my hand from the door handle, telling myself that delivering pizzas wasn't worth risking my life. But then, from within the house, I heard a voice calling out, "Come in." It was a woman's voice, but it sounded distant, as if originating from the far end of the house. Doubts still lingered, but my curiosity got the better of me, and I returned to the door, knocking once more. "Come in." My unease slightly abated, but I remained skeptical. She had indicated she was alone, yet 8 pizzas had been ordered. Dismissing my concerns as paranoia, I reluctantly pushed the door open and entered the dimly lit house, keeping it slightly ajar just in case I needed to escape quickly. The interior mirrored the yard's disarray, with piles of trash strewn about. The silence was stifling, save for the one light shining at the top of a grand staircase to my right. The voice from upstairs beckoned me to wait as it promised to descend in a minute. Yet something was amiss. Her voice, which had sounded genuine outside, now seemed off, unnatural, as if a man was mimicking a woman. My instinct screamed at me, and I decided it was time to leave. However, as I reached for the doorknob, I noticed a shadowy figure dart across the sidewalk and hide in the tall grass of the yard. Darkness obscured the figure's features, but it was unmistakably watching me. It had an oddly small head, not much larger than a baby's, yet the body appeared fully grown. Strangest of all, I thought I glimpsed a short, thick tail, much like that of a stalking lion, swaying behind it. I couldn't discern its eyes, but I was certain it observed me. I rushed back inside, locking the door behind me. Inside the house, I felt trapped. My phone was in my car, and I realized I had left it there. Panic washed over me. Alone and vulnerable, I stood in the darkened room, confronted by 8 pizzas, a stack of mail, and the palpable sense of impending danger. Then, a voice echoed from the hallway. "I know you're in here." It was no longer the woman's voice, but something else entirely. I retreated further into the house, hoping to find an escape route or a phone to call for help. My senses were heightened. Every creak and crack of the house magnified in my ears. I ventured down a hallway, searching for a back door or any way out. The house remained shrouded in darkness, with boarded-up windows and locked doors. At the end of the hallway, I had one door left to check. It squeaked open, and the noise sent a shiver down my spine. Suddenly, the light near the front door went out, plunging me into complete darkness. "I know you're in here," the voice repeated, now closer. Confident that I was trapped, I hastily entered the room, shutting the door behind me. There was no lock, but I didn't have time to search for a light switch. Candles dotted the room, casting eerie, flickering light. A pentagram, drawn in what I presumed to be blood, adorned the floor, and an unsettling odor hung in the air. In the center, a chair held a grotesque pile, perhaps intestines, spilling blood onto the ground. From behind the door, I could hear footsteps thundering down the hallway, at a steady, confident pace, like the man knew I was trapped. I looked around the room and noticed that moonlight was shining in through a window that was located on the back wall. Unlike all the other windows I passed, this one was not boarded up. I ran towards the window, acting before thinking, and dived toward freedom just as I heard the door opening up behind me. The glass shattered around me, and I felt several sharp pains throughout my body, as shards of glass sliced parts of my arms and face. I hit the ground hard, but was up in a flash and sprinted around to the front of the house, trying my hardest to make it through the tall grass without tripping. I looked back only once to see if I was being chased, but no one was following me. I saw the briefest glimpse of a figure standing behind the window that I broke through, but it didn't look like the man was going to take chase after me. He just stood there behind the broken window, and as I was rounding the corner of the house with my car now in sight, I could make out his heavy laughter from across the yard. I pulled open my car door and threw myself in with one quick motion. I started the car and nearly crashed into a tree as I sped away down the driveway. I didn't see that weird creature that was crouching in the grass earlier. But as I was driving away, I looked back in my rearview mirror and noticed that the front door of the house was open, even though I locked it before searching for a way out. I made sure that I was far enough away from that house before grabbing my phone and calling the police. I told the operator everything in a crazed, mad rush of words, and also mentioned that I was in need of medical attention. The operator told me that help was on the way, and not too long after that, I could hear police sirens approaching from the distance. After the police arrived, everything was just one big blur. I don't remember if I passed out or not, but all that I could recall are these small snippets of information, like riding in an ambulance as the paramedics tried to stop the bleeding from my cuts, and then being questioned by the police while I was in the hospital. Everything in between was blank. Most of my face made it out pretty unscathed because I blocked it using my arms, but I ended up getting somewhere in the realm of 70 stitches throughout the rest of my body, and the doctor said that I was lucky I hadn't bled out. I managed to find out what happened to the man that tried to abduct me after I was released from the hospital. Apparently, when the police arrived at the house, the man was sitting in his driveway with his hands up in surrender as the house behind him burned down from a fire that he had intentionally started. The rest of the story I followed on my local news broadcast, as did basically every other person in that town. I was expecting the story to be like something right out of a horror movie. I figured that the man murdered the original owners of that house and then stayed there for a while, practicing his weird rituals, while the people he murdered rotted away in the backyard somewhere. What really ended up happening, though, was even more disturbing than what I originally thought. The owners of the house were a really wealthy old couple who were currently living in Florida. They used the house as a summer home at one point, but they hadn't been back for a very long time and were not planning on coming back. So they decided to give the house to one of their grandsons while they continued to pay the bills for it. The man that was there when I was delivering the pizzas was, in fact, the old couple's grandson. His name was Stanley Wardell, and he had been living in the house all by himself for over 2 years. All of his family said that they lost contact with Stanley about a year ago, but none of them made an effort to try and reconnect with him because Stanley was seen as the black sheep of the family. On the night that he was arrested, he admitted that he killed 3 people over the past 6 months and was planning on killing me as well. 2 of the 3 victims were an unlucky couple that had been visiting family from out of town. The other person was Billy Holmes. The little boy that I remembered had gone missing a few weeks earlier. During my statement to the police, I mentioned the creature that I saw hiding in the grass, and also the pentagram that was drawn on the floor in the room with the window where I had escaped. But since Stanley burned his house down, nothing that I described was found. As for the creature with the small head and thick tail, the police said that I imagined it from the amount of shock that I was experiencing at the time. I wanted to believe them, but something inside me knew that they were wrong. And if all of this wasn't weird enough, the trial that took place after Stanley was arrested are when things really started to get disturbing. Even though Stanley admitted to killing the 3 people and was pleading guilty, he stood up in front of the courtroom the very first day of his prosecution and said that he was not the one that murdered those people, only that he was taking the blame for someone else. At first, the judge couldn't tell if Stanley was just trying to confuse the jury or if he really meant it. But either way, question after question was thrown at Stanley to try and figure out who this other person was. Stanley remained quiet though, only opening his mouth to tell the judge that he was never going to say who really did it, and that they were never going to catch the real murderer. The judge was prepared to offer a shorter sentence if Stanley provided proof that someone else committed the murders, but he didn't budge. When asked why the other person wanted to kill those people, Stanley laughed at the judge dryly and said it was because it was hungry. The judge put off all of this nonsense as Stanley's way of trying to scare the jury and sentenced him to serve 3 lifetime sentences with no hope of probation. That was the end of it for a while. Stanley's name left the paper and the town started to recover from this horrible event, only to be thrown back into the chaos 3 weeks after the trial ended. Stanley Wardell was found dead inside his prison cell early one morning after he didn't come out for roll call. He had committed suicide by using a jagged piece of metal to cut his own throat open. But if you could believe it, that wasn't the weirdest part. A rumor had leaked out of the press a few days after the suicide, which stated that Stanley had written something on the walls of his jail cell in his own blood minutes before he died. From the source that I read the words that Stanley had allegedly written were "It will rise again," and the warning was accompanied by a crude drawing of some kind of creature whose features were not described. I looked through multiple stories hoping to find a description of the monster that Stanley drew, dreading the fact that it might be what I saw in the front yard that night, but I never found anything on it. I'm still too terrified to sleep, and I am constantly looking over my shoulder, scared of what I might see every time I turn my head. I honestly do not know if I imagined seeing that creature in the front yard. I was under a lot of stress at the time, and fear can do crazy things to a person's brain. But I keep asking myself this: if the thing that I saw crouching in the grass that one night was not real, then why do I keep waking up in the middle of the night afraid? And if it is real, then fear is the least of my worries.